The black sedan rolled through the iron gates just as the evening sky turned deep purple, and Victor Morno sat in the back seat with his jaw tight and his mind running through the numbers from the meeting he had just left. He was a man who controlled half the city without raising his voice, a man whose name made grown men sweat, and tonight he wanted nothing more than to pour himself a drink and sit in the silence of his mansion where no one dared disturb him. The car came to a smooth stop in the circular driveway, and his driver opened the door without a word. Victor stepped out, adjusting the cuffs of his black suit, his cold gray eyes scanning the front of the house out of habit, always alert, always calculating. But then he saw something that made him pause, something that did not belong in his carefully controlled world. Standing by the heavy wooden door of his mansion was a little girl, no more than 8 or 9 years old, wearing a faded blue dress that was too big for her thin frame and clutching a small cloth bag against her chest like it held everything she owned. Her dark hair was pulled back in a messy ponytail, and her wide brown eyes were fixed on him with a mixture of fear and determination that he had seen before in the faces of men twice her size. She stood perfectly still as he approached, her small shoulders squared, her chin lifted just slightly, and Victor felt a flicker of something unfamiliar stir in his chest before he crushed it down and let his expression harden into the mask he wore with everyone. He stopped a few feet away from her, towering over her small form, and his voice came out low and cold. "Who are you and why are you at my door?" The little girl flinched at the sound of his voice, but she did not step back or look away. Instead, she took a shaky breath and her words came out in a rush, tumbling over each other like she had been practicing them all day and was afraid she would forget if she did not say them fast enough. "Sir, my name is Alina, and my mom is Maria. She works for you. She cleans your house every day, but today she is very sick and she cannot come. So I came instead because she needs this job and I told her I would work for her today so you would not be angry." Her voice wavered on the last word, and Victor saw her hands tighten around the cloth bag until her knuckles turned white, but she held his gaze and waited for his response. Victor knew Maria, of course. She had worked in his house for almost 3 years, a quiet woman in her early 30s who did her job without complaining and never asked questions, exactly the kind of person he preferred to have around. He had noticed she had a daughter, but he had never given it much thought because his staff's personal lives were none of his concern as long as they did their work. Now here was that daughter, standing at his door like a tiny soldier ready to take her mother's place, and Victor felt his irritation rising because this was not how things worked in his world. Children did not belong here. They complicated things, they made people soft. He turned to his head of security, Dmitri, who had followed him out of the car and was standing nearby with his arms crossed and a frown on his scarred face. "Call Maria and tell her to come get her daughter immediately. This is not a place for children." Dmitri nodded and pulled out his phone, but before he could dial, Alina took a sudden step forward and her voice came out louder this time, desperate and pleading. "Please, sir, please do not call her. She is sleeping and she has a very high fever, and if you wake her up she will try to come here even though she can barely stand. And I promised her I would do the work so she could rest. I know how to clean, I have watched her many times. Please let me try, I will do a good job, I promise." Tears were forming in the corners of her eyes now, but she blinked them back furiously, refusing to let them fall. And Victor found himself studying her face with an intensity that surprised him. There was something in her expression that reminded him of a time long ago, a time he did not like to think about, when he had been young and desperate and willing to do anything to survive. He saw that same desperation in Alina's eyes, that same fierce determination not to fail, and for a moment he hesitated. Dmitri was still waiting for his order, phone in hand, and Victor could feel his men watching him from their positions around the property, waiting to see what he would do. He had built his reputation on being ruthless and unmovable, on never making exceptions and never showing weakness. But as he looked down at this little girl who was trembling but refusing to back down, he felt that unfamiliar stirring in his chest again. "Put the phone away," he said to Dmitri, his voice still cold but with an edge of curiosity now. Dmitri raised an eyebrow but obeyed without question, sliding his phone back into his pocket. Victor turned his attention back to Alina and spoke slowly, letting each word sink in. "You think you can do your mother's job? Do you even know what her job involves? This is a large house with many rooms and I have high standards. If you cannot do the work properly, you will leave immediately and I will find someone else. Do you understand?" Alina nodded so hard her ponytail bounced, and a small, fragile smile broke across her face like sunlight through storm clouds. "Yes, sir, I understand, thank you, sir. I will work very hard, you will not be disappointed." She clutched her cloth bag tighter and waited for him to tell her what to do, and Victor felt the weight of the decision he had just made settling over him like a heavy coat. He gestured for her to follow him and walked into the mansion, his footsteps echoing on the marble floor of the entrance hall. Alina hurried after him, her small shoes making soft pattering sounds, and he could hear her quick, shallow breathing as she tried to keep up with his long strides. The inside of the mansion was exactly as he preferred it. Dark wood, leather furniture, dim lighting that created shadows in every corner, a place that felt more like a fortress than a home. He led her through the main hall and into the kitchen, a vast room with stainless steel appliances and black granite countertops that gleamed under the overhead lights. "Your mother usually starts in the kitchen," he said, his tone businesslike now as if he were briefing one of his men on a job. "She cleans the counters, washes any dishes, sweeps and mops the floor, takes out the trash. Then she moves to the dining room, the living areas, the bathrooms, and finally the upstairs bedrooms. It takes her about 6 hours to do everything properly. Can you do that?" Alina looked around the enormous kitchen and he saw her swallow hard, but she nodded again and set her cloth bag down on one of the chairs. "Yes, sir, I can do it. I have helped my mom before. I know what to do." She pulled out a pair of yellow rubber gloves from her bag that were far too large for her small hands and started to put them on, and Victor watched her struggle with them for a moment before she managed to get them on, the excess material bunching up around her wrists. He should have left then. He had a dozen things to do, calls to make, accounts to review, but instead he found himself leaning against the doorway with his arms crossed, watching as Alina dragged a step stool over to the sink and climbed up so she could reach the faucet. She turned on the water and started washing the few glasses that had been left on the counter, her movements careful and deliberate, and he could see the concentration on her face as she scrubbed each one thoroughly before rinsing it and setting it on the drying rack. Minutes passed in silence except for the sound of running water and the clink of glass, and Victor realized he was still standing there watching her work. Dmitri appeared in the doorway behind him, clearly confused about why his boss was spending his evening observing a child wash dishes, but Victor ignored him. There was something mesmerizing about the scene, something that pulled at memories he had buried deep and tried to forget. He remembered being young and small and trying to do work meant for adults, remembered the weight of responsibility pressing down on shoulders too narrow to carry it, remembered the fear of failing and the determination not to. Alina finished with the glasses and moved on to wiping down the counters, spraying cleaning solution and scrubbing in small circles just like she had probably seen her mother do 100 times. The counters were high, and she had to stretch to reach the back, standing on her tiptoes on the step stool, and Victor saw her wobble slightly before catching her balance. She was working hard, he could see that, her face flushed with effort and small beads of sweat forming on her forehead, but she was also clearly exhausted. There were dark circles under her eyes and her movements were slower than they should be, like she was forcing her body to keep going through sheer willpower. "When did you last eat?" Victor asked suddenly, his voice breaking the silence and making Alina jump. She turned to look at him, her eyes wide with surprise that he was still there, and he saw her hesitate before answering. "I had some bread this morning, sir," she said quietly, turning back to her work as if she did not want to stop even for a conversation. "I am not hungry, I am fine." Victor frowned because he knew what that meant. It meant she had not eaten all day, had probably given whatever food they had to her sick mother, and was now running on nothing but determination and fear. He pushed away from the doorway and walked to the refrigerator, pulling it open and scanning the contents. His housekeeper, an older woman named Agnes who came in the mornings, always kept it well stocked with more food than he usually ate. He pulled out containers of leftover chicken, rice, vegetables, and set them on the counter. "Stop what you are doing and eat," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "You cannot work if you collapse from hunger, and I do not want to explain to your mother why I let her daughter faint in my kitchen." Alina looked at the food and then at him, uncertainty written all over her face. "But sir, I need to finish the cleaning. I promised I would do all the work." "You will finish after you eat," Victor said, pulling out a plate and starting to load it with food. "Sit down." He pointed to the small table in the corner of the kitchen where the staff usually ate, and Alina slowly climbed down from her step stool and walked over to it, her eyes never leaving the plate he was preparing. He heated the food in the microwave, the humming of the machine filling the silence, and when it was done he set the plate in front of her along with a fork and a glass of water. Alina stared at the plate like she could not quite believe it was real, and then she looked up at him with such raw gratitude in her eyes that Victor felt uncomfortable and had to look away. "Thank you, sir," she whispered, and then she started to eat small, careful bites at first and then faster as her hunger took over, and Victor turned away to give her privacy and found Dmitri still standing in the doorway, now looking at him like he had grown a second head. "Not a word," Victor warned in a low voice as he walked past Dmitri and out into the hallway, and Dmitri wisely stayed silent. Victor went to his study, a room lined with bookshelves and dominated by a large mahogany desk, and he poured himself the drink he had been wanting since he got home. The whiskey burned going down and he stood by the window, looking out at the darkening grounds and trying to understand why he had just fed a child and let her work in his house, when every instinct told him to send her away. He stayed in his study for about 20 minutes, dealing with emails and messages, but his concentration was fractured and he kept thinking about Alina in the kitchen. Finally, he gave up on work and walked back to check on her, telling himself it was just to make sure she had not broken anything or hurt herself. What he found when he entered the kitchen made him stop in his tracks. Alina had finished eating and cleaned her plate, and now she was back at work, but she was struggling badly. She was trying to mop the floor, but the mop was almost as tall as she was and the bucket of water was heavy. He watched as she dipped the mop in the bucket, tried to wring it out with her small hands, and then pushed it across the floor with visible effort. She was moving slowly, her arms shaking with fatigue, and as he watched, she stumbled slightly and had to catch herself against the counter. She stood there for a moment, breathing hard, and then she straightened up and went back to mopping, her jaw set with determination. Victor felt something crack in the armor he had built around himself over the years, some wall he had carefully constructed to keep the world at a distance, and he found himself walking over to her before he could think better of it. "That is enough," he said, and his voice came out gentler than he intended. "You have done enough work for today. I will have Dmitri take you home." Alina looked up at him and he saw panic flash across her face. "But sir, I have not finished. I still need to do the dining room and the living room and the bathrooms and the bedrooms. My mother always does all of it. Please let me finish. I can do it. I am not too tired." "You can barely stand," Victor pointed out, and it was true. She was swaying slightly on her feet, her face pale except for two bright spots of color on her cheeks, and her eyes were glassy with exhaustion. "You need to go home and rest." Tears spilled over Alina's cheeks now, running down her face as she shook her head frantically. "Please, sir, please do not send me away. I need to work. My mother needs this job. We need the money, please." Her voice broke on the last word and she wiped at her tears with the back of her hand, leaving a streak of dirt across her cheek, and Victor felt his chest tighten in a way that was almost painful. "Why do you need the money so badly?" he asked, crouching down so he was at her eye level, and up close he could see how young she really was, how small and fragile and scared. "Tell me the truth, Alina. Why is this so important?" Alina's lower lip trembled and she took a shaky breath, and when she spoke her voice was so quiet he had to lean in to hear her. "My mother is sick, really sick, not just today but for a long time now, and she needs medicine but we do not have enough money for it. She works so hard and she never complains, but I know she is in pain and I know she is getting worse. And I thought if I could work for her today then maybe we would have enough money for her medicine and she could get better." The words poured out of her in a rush, and then she was crying harder, her small body shaking with sobs. And Victor felt something inside him shift and rearrange itself into a shape he did not recognize. He had spent years building an empire through ruthlessness and calculated cruelty, had made decisions that destroyed lives without losing a moment of sleep, had trained himself not to care about anything except power and control. But looking at this little girl who loved her mother so much she was willing to collapse from exhaustion just to help her, he felt something he had not felt in a very long time. He felt ashamed. Ashamed that he had so much while they had so little. Ashamed that he had been about to send her away without understanding. Ashamed that he had forgotten what it meant to be desperate and afraid and willing to do anything for the people you loved. He reached out slowly, half expecting Alina to flinch away from him, but she did not move as he gently wiped the tears from her cheeks with his thumb. "Listen to me carefully," he said, his voice low and serious. "You are not going to work any more tonight. You are going to go home to your mother. But first you are going to tell me exactly what is wrong with her and what medicine she needs, and I am going to make sure she gets it. Do you understand?" Alina's eyes went wide and she stared at him like she could not believe what she was hearing. You would do that, but why? We are nobody, we cannot pay you back." "You do not need to pay me back," Victor said, and he was surprised by how much he meant it. "Your mother works for me and she does good work, and I take care of the people who work for me. That is all you need to know." It was not really true. He had never particularly cared about his staff beyond making sure they did their jobs, but in this moment he wanted it to be true, wanted to be the kind of man who would help a sick woman and her desperate daughter. Alina threw her arms around his neck so suddenly he almost fell backward, her small body pressing against him as she hugged him with all her strength. "Thank you, thank you, thank you," she sobbed into his shoulder, and Victor froze, unsure what to do with his hands, unsure when he had last been hugged by anyone, unsure how to handle the storm of unfamiliar emotions crashing through him. Slowly, carefully, he brought his arms up and patted her back awkwardly, and he felt her relax slightly against him, her sobs quieting to hiccups and sniffles. They stayed like that for a long moment, this unlikely pair in the middle of his spotless kitchen, and Victor found himself thinking about choices and consequences and the strange ways life could change direction in a single evening. He had woken up this morning as one kind of man, and now, with a little girl crying grateful tears on his shoulder, he felt like he might be becoming someone else entirely, and the strangest part was that he was not sure he minded. Victor drove Alina home himself, which shocked Dmitri so thoroughly the man actually forgot to close his mouth for a full 10 seconds. Victor had not driven himself anywhere in years, always preferring to sit in the back seat while someone else navigated traffic, but tonight he wanted the control and the distraction of focusing on the road. Alina sat in the passenger seat of his car, looking impossibly small surrounded by black leather and expensive technology, her cloth bag clutched in her lap and her eyes wide as she stared out the window at the passing streets. She had given him her address in a quiet voice, a neighborhood on the east side of the city that Victor knew by reputation as one of the poorest and most dangerous areas, the kind of place where his own organization operated but where he himself never visited. The drive took 20 minutes through increasingly run-down streets, past buildings with broken windows and graffiti-covered walls, past groups of men standing on corners who straightened up and stared as his expensive car rolled by. Victor noted it all with the practiced eye of someone who understood exactly how these neighborhoods worked, who controlled them and how, and he felt his jaw tighten as he realized this was where Maria brought Alina home every night after working in his mansion. The contrast between his world and theirs was so stark it felt obscene. Alina directed him to a narrow street lined with old apartment buildings that looked like they were barely standing, and she pointed to one in the middle of the block that was slightly more decrepit than the others. "We live on the third floor," she said quietly, and Victor pulled the car to the curb and sat for a moment, looking at the building with its cracked facade and rusted fire escapes and feeling that unfamiliar shame twist in his gut again. He got out of the car and came around to open Alina's door, and she climbed out slowly, clearly nervous about bringing him to her home. "It is not very nice," she said, her voice apologetic, and Victor shook his head. "Show me where your mother is," he said simply, and Alina led him to the building's entrance where the door hung crooked on its hinges. The stairwell inside was dark and smelled of mold and garbage, and Victor followed Alina up 3 flights of stairs with water-stained walls and flickering lights that barely worked. She stopped in front of a door with peeling green paint and the number 301 hanging sideways, and she pulled a key out of her bag with shaking hands. "My mom does not know I left," Alina whispered as she unlocked the door. "I waited until she fell asleep and then I went to your house. She is going to be very upset with me." The apartment inside was tiny, maybe 2 rooms total, but it was clean and organized despite its obvious poverty. There was a small living area with a threadbare couch and a rickety table, and through an open doorway Victor could see a bedroom with a single bed. Alina led him to the bedroom and Victor stopped in the doorway, his chest tightening at what he saw. Maria was lying in the bed, covered with a thin blanket that had been washed so many times it was nearly transparent, and even from across the room he could see she was very sick. Her face was flushed with fever, her dark hair plastered to her forehead with sweat, and her breathing was labored and rattling in her chest. She was asleep or unconscious, he could not tell which, and she did not stir as they entered the room. Alina went to her mother's side and put a small hand on her forehead, and Victor saw the worry deepen in her young face. "She is still very hot," Alina said, looking up at him with frightened eyes. "She has been like this for 2 days and it keeps getting worse. I have been giving her the medicine we have, but I think it is not strong enough." Victor moved closer to the bed and looked down at Maria, really looked at her for the first time as a person rather than just an employee. She was younger than he had thought, probably not yet 35, with fine features and long lashes that rested against her feverish cheeks. Even sick and unconscious, she had a quiet dignity about her, and Victor found himself wondering what her life had been like, what circumstances had brought her to work in his house and live in this place with her daughter. He had never bothered to ask, had never cared to know, and now he felt the weight of that indifference pressing down on him. "What medicine does she have?" he asked, and Alina showed him a nearly empty bottle of generic fever reducer that cost almost nothing and did almost nothing for serious illness. Victor pulled out his phone and dialed a number he had memorized years ago, and when a gruff voice answered, he spoke with the authority of someone used to being obeyed immediately. "Dr. Petrov, this is Victor Morno. I need you to come to an address right now and bring your medical bag. I have someone who needs immediate attention." He rattled off the address while the doctor spluttered protests about the hour and the neighborhood, but Victor cut him off coldly. You owe me 3 favors from that situation last year. I am calling in one of them now. Be here in 30 minutes or I will be very disappointed. He hung up before the doctor could respond and turned to find Alina staring at him with her mouth open. You called a doctor, she whispered, like she could not quite believe it was real. A real doctor is coming here. Yes, Victor said, slipping his phone back into his pocket. He will examine your mother and give her proper medicine and tell us what is wrong. He is very good at his job and he will help her. Alina's eyes filled with tears again, and she looked like she wanted to hug him but was not sure if she should. So instead she just nodded over and over while whispering thank you so many times the words blurred together. Victor felt awkward and out of place in this tiny apartment with its peeling wallpaper and broken furniture. So he walked back to the living area and looked around more carefully. There was not much to see. The old couch, the wobbly table with 2 mismatched chairs, a hot plate in one corner that served as a kitchen, a few dishes stacked neatly on a shelf. No television, no computer, no books or toys or anything that was not absolutely necessary for survival. On the wall there was a single photograph in a cheap frame, and Victor moved closer to look at it. It showed Maria and Alina from a few years ago, both smiling at the camera. And in the photo Maria was holding Alina close with such obvious love in her eyes that Victor had to look away. He heard Alina moving around in the bedroom, talking quietly to her mother even though Maria was not conscious enough to respond. And he found himself listening to the soft murmur of her voice as she told her mother that everything was going to be okay now, that a doctor was coming, that the nice man from the big house was helping them. The nice man. Victor almost laughed at that description because no one had called him nice in decades. And if they knew the things he had done, the orders he had given, they would use very different words to describe him. Dr. Petrov arrived exactly 28 minutes later, a portly man in his 60s with a bald head and nervous eyes who looked extremely uncomfortable as he climbed the stairs carrying his leather medical bag. Victor met him at the door and led him to the bedroom without pleasantries, and the doctor's discomfort turned to professional focus as soon as he saw Maria in the bed. He shooed Alina and Victor out of the room and closed the door, and Victor could hear him moving around, talking to himself as he examined his patient. Alina stood in the living area wringing her hands and looking at the closed bedroom door like she could see through it if she concentrated hard enough. Victor sat down on the couch, which creaked alarmingly under his weight, and gestured for Alina to sit beside him. She perched on the edge of the cushion, her back straight and her hands folded in her lap, and they waited in silence that felt heavy with worry and hope. 15 minutes passed, then 20, and Victor found himself studying Alina's profile, the way she kept biting her lower lip and the way her small hands clenched and unclenched in her lap. She was so young to carry such heavy burdens, too young to have to worry about adult problems like money and medicine, and whether her mother would live or die, and Victor felt anger building in his chest at the unfairness of it all. The bedroom door finally opened and Dr. Petrov came out, wiping his hands on a cloth and looking serious. Alina jumped to her feet and Victor stood more slowly, and they both waited for the doctor to speak. Your mother has severe pneumonia, Petrov said, directing his words to Alina but glancing at Victor. Her lungs are badly infected and she needs strong antibiotics immediately. I have given her an injection that will start fighting the infection, and I am leaving pills that she needs to take 3 times a day for the next 10 days. She also needs rest, proper nutrition, and someone to monitor her fever and make sure she drinks plenty of fluids. Will she be okay? Alina asked, her voice trembling, and Petrov's expression softened slightly as he looked down at her. If she takes the medicine and rests, yes, she should recover fully. But she was very close to needing hospitalization, maybe another day or 2, and it would have been much more serious. You did the right thing getting help when you did. He handed Alina a bottle of pills and gave her careful instructions on how to administer them, and then he turned to Victor and lowered his voice. She has been sick for a while, probably weeks, and she kept working through it until her body could not take any more. She is severely run down and exhausted. She needs time to heal properly or this will just happen again. Victor nodded and walked the doctor to the door, and as Petrov was leaving he paused and gave Victor a curious look. I have worked for you for 5 years, Mr. Morneau, and you have never asked me to make a house call to help someone like this. May I ask why you are involved? Victor met his eyes and his voice came out cold enough to make Petrov take a step back. You may not ask. Send me your bill and consider your debt reduced by 1 favor. He closed the door before the doctor could respond and turned back to find Alina reading the instructions on the pill bottle with fierce concentration, her lips moving as she sounded out the difficult medical words. I will give her the first pill as soon as she wakes up, Alina said, looking up at him. And I will make sure she takes them all, every single one, exactly like the doctor said. The determination in her voice reminded Victor of how she had looked standing at his door earlier that evening, small but unbreakable, and he felt something shift in his chest again, that crack in his armor widening just a little more. Your mother cannot work for a while, Victor said, and he saw Alina's face fall, saw the fear creep back into her eyes. She needs at least 2 weeks to recover, maybe more. Do not worry about money. I will continue to pay her salary while she is sick, and I will have food delivered to you every day so you do not have to worry about that either. Your only job is to take care of your mother and make sure she gets better. Do you understand? Alina stared at him like he was speaking a foreign language, her eyes growing wider and wider until Victor thought they might swallow her whole face. You will pay her even though she is not working, and send us food, but why would you do that? Nobody does things like that for people like us. I am doing it because I choose to, Victor said, and it was the simplest truth he could offer. He did not fully understand his own motivations, did not know when this little girl and her sick mother had become important to him, but he knew with absolute certainty that he could not walk away and leave them to struggle alone. You and your mother are under my protection now. That means I make sure you have what you need. That is how it works. Alina launched herself at him again, wrapping her thin arms around his waist and pressing her face against his chest, and this time Victor did not freeze. He put his hand on her head gently, feeling her soft hair under his palm, and he let her cry against him while he looked around the tiny apartment and made calculations in his head. This building was a death trap. The neighborhood was dangerous. The living conditions were completely unacceptable for a child, and he found himself thinking about solutions and possibilities and how much power he actually had to change things when he decided to use it. After a few moments, Alina pulled back and wiped her eyes, and she gave him a watery smile that transformed her whole face from worried and frightened to something approaching hopeful. I do not know how to thank you, she said quietly. You have been so kind to us, and we are just normal people. We are nobody special, but you treated us like we matter. You do matter, Victor said, and he was surprised by the roughness in his own voice. Do not ever think you do not matter, Alina. You and your mother are working hard and trying to survive and take care of each other, and that makes you better than most of the people I know. He meant it too, every word, because in the world he usually inhabited people were selfish and cruel and only cared about their own power and wealth. But here in this falling apart apartment, he had found more courage and love and genuine goodness than he had seen in years. He stayed a while longer, until Maria stirred and woke up briefly, her eyes unfocused and confused as she saw Victor standing in her home. Alina rushed to her side and explained everything in a tumbling rush of words, about going to work at the mansion and the doctor and the medicine, and Victor watched Maria's face cycle through shock and embarrassment and gratitude. She tried to sit up and thank him, but she was too weak and fell back against the pillow, and Victor moved closer to the bed and looked down at her. Rest and get better, he said, his voice gentler than Maria had probably ever heard it. Your job will be waiting for you when you are well, and you do not need to worry about anything else. Alina will take care of you and I will make sure you have everything you need, just focus on healing. Maria's eyes filled with tears and she reached out a trembling hand toward him, and after a moment's hesitation Victor took it, feeling how small and cold her fingers were in his. Thank you, she whispered, her voice hoarse and broken. I cannot believe you would do this for us. You are a good man. Victor almost laughed at that because he knew exactly what kind of man he was, knew the blood on his hands and the darkness in his soul, but looking down at Maria's grateful face he wanted desperately to be the man she thought he was, wanted to deserve the trust he saw in her eyes. Sleep now, he said instead of responding to her thanks, and he gently laid her hand back on the blanket and stepped away from the bed. Alina walked him to the door and they stood there for a moment, this powerful crime lord and this small brave girl. And Victor found himself not wanting to leave, not wanting to go back to his cold mansion and his violent world. But he had responsibilities and people waiting for him, so he reached out and patted Alina's head awkwardly one more time. If your mother gets worse or if you need anything, you call this number, he said, handing her a card with his private cell phone number written on it. Anytime, day or night, do not hesitate, understand? Yes, sir, Alina said, clutching the card like it was made of gold. I understand, thank you for everything, you saved my mom's life tonight. Victor nodded and turned to leave, but Alina's voice stopped him. Sir, can I ask you something? He looked back at her and she was biting her lip nervously. Why did you help us? You could have just sent me away, you could have fired my mom, you did not have to do any of this, so why did you? Victor was quiet for a long moment, thinking about how to answer, thinking about all the complicated emotions churning inside him that he did not have names for. Finally, he said, "Because a long time ago I was a lot like you. I was young and scared and trying to take care of someone I loved and nobody helped me. I had to fight for everything alone and it made me into someone hard and cold. But tonight, looking at you, I remembered what it felt like to be that scared child, and I decided that maybe I could be different. Maybe I could be the person I needed back then but never had. Does that make sense?" Alina nodded slowly, her eyes serious and understanding beyond her years. "Yes, sir, it makes sense. I think you are already different. I think you are already that person." Victor felt his throat tighten and he had to clear it before he could speak. "Good night, Alina. Take care of your mother." He turned and walked down the hallway before she could see the emotions he was struggling to control, and he took the stairs two at a time until he burst out into the night air and stood on the sidewalk breathing hard like he had been running for miles. The drive back to his mansion was quiet and dark, and Victor's mind was racing the whole way, replaying the evening's events over and over. By the time he pulled through his gates and parked in his driveway, he had made several decisions that would have shocked anyone who knew him. He sat in his car for a while, looking up at his enormous house with its dozens of empty rooms, and he thought about the tiny apartment across the city with its peeling paint and broken furniture where two people loved each other fiercely and survived against impossible odds. Dmitri was waiting for him in the entrance hall, clearly bursting with questions but too well trained to ask them directly. Victor walked past him toward his study but paused and turned back. "Tomorrow, I want you to arrange for a food delivery service to take meals to Maria every day until I say otherwise. Good food, healthy food, enough for her and her daughter. Also, find out who owns that apartment building they live in and get me a meeting with them. And call Marcus and tell him I want to see him first thing in the morning. We need to talk about expanding our protection services." Dmitri blinked in surprise but nodded and pulled out his phone to make notes. "Anything else, boss?" Victor thought for a moment and then said quietly, "Yes, I want you to set up a fund, something discreet for staff emergencies. Medical expenses, family problems, whatever they need. Make sure all our people know that if they are in trouble they can ask for help. We take care of our own, that is the new policy." Now Dmitri was staring at him with open shock, and Victor could not blame him because this was completely out of character for the ruthless boss he had worked for all these years. "Boss, are you feeling okay? Did something happen tonight?" Victor smiled, a real genuine smile that felt strange on his face after so many years of cold expressions. "Yes, Dmitri, something happened tonight. I remembered what it means to be human. Now go make those arrangements and let me work." He went into his study and closed the door, and he stood by the window looking out at his grounds and thinking about the future. He had spent so many years building walls around himself, becoming harder and colder and more ruthless, telling himself it was necessary to survive in his world. But tonight, a little girl with a brave heart and a sick mother had shown him that maybe there was another way. Maybe he could be strong and powerful and still have compassion. Maybe he could run his empire and still care about the people in it. Maybe it was not too late to become someone better. He pulled out his phone and looked at the contacts list, scrolling through names of associates and business partners and people who feared him, and he realized he did not have a single real friend in the entire list. His life was full of power and money and respect born from fear, but it was empty of the things that actually mattered: love, connection, purpose beyond just accumulating more wealth and control. Alina and Maria had almost nothing in terms of material possessions, but they had each other and they had love, and Victor suddenly understood that they were richer than he had ever been. He sat down at his desk and pulled out a notebook, and he started writing down ideas and plans. He would start small with Maria and Alina, making sure they had everything they needed and more. He would find them a better place to live, somewhere safe and clean. He would make sure Alina could go to a good school and have the childhood she deserved. He would give Maria a raise and better working conditions and health insurance that would actually cover her when she was sick. And then he would expand outward, treating his other employees better, creating systems to help them when they struggled, becoming the kind of boss people respected because he took care of them, not just because they feared him. It would not erase the things he had done or make him a saint. Victor knew that. He was still a criminal, still ran an organization that operated outside the law, still made hard decisions that hurt people sometimes. But maybe he could balance the scales a little bit, could use his power for something good instead of just for himself, could become the kind of man that a little girl would call nice and actually have it be true. He worked late into the night, making plans and calculations, and when he finally went to bed as dawn was breaking over the city, he felt something he had not felt in years. He felt hope. Hope that he could change, hope that he could be better, hope that one small act of kindness to a desperate child and her sick mother might be the beginning of a whole new path. And as he drifted off to sleep, he found himself thinking about Alina's smile when he had promised to help them. And he smiled too, alone in his big empty house that somehow felt a little less empty now. The next morning, Victor woke up with a sense of purpose he had not experienced in decades. And the first thing he did was check his phone to make sure the food delivery had been arranged and that there were no emergency calls from Alina. Then he got dressed and went down to breakfast where Dimitri was waiting with updates and Marcus, his head of operations, was sitting nervously at the table clearly wondering why he had been summoned. Victor sat down and looked at both men, and he began to explain his new vision for how things would work in his organization. And though they both looked shocked and confused at first, they listened and they took notes, because Victor Morno was still the boss, and when he decided something, it happened. And across the city, in a tiny apartment on the third floor of a crumbling building, Alina was carefully giving her mother the second dose of antibiotics and telling her all about the amazing man who had helped them. And Maria was listening with tears running down her face, grateful beyond words that in their darkest moments someone had seen them and cared. And though neither of them knew it yet, their lives were about to change in ways they could never have imagined. All because a little girl had been brave enough to stand at a powerful man's door and ask for a chance. And that man had been reminded of his own humanity just in time to save not only them, but perhaps himself as well. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more powerful and emotional stories like this, make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Turn on the notification bell so you never miss our next story. And tell us in the comments, what would you have done if you were in their place? Your support helps us bring you more unforgettable stories. See you in the next one.